Hi, everybody. Today's class agenda is two major things. The first is we're going to take a quiz in Schoology over biomolecules and proteins. And so that's kind of how we'll start off class, and we're going to kind of review those two things. That would be entries 5 and 6. And then we're going to start respiration, which does tie to biomolecules and proteins and kind of how we obtain energy. Your homework for today will hopefully be finishing out our 7A page if for some reason you don't get a chance to, and we're going to continue that later on in the week. So let me go ahead and jump into our presentation for today. Cellular respiration, or respiration. And it's called cellular respiration because this is something that our cells, which we are made of, does for us. And it's a very important function that ties to photosynthesis and the biomolecules that we've been talking about before. So I want you to think back. Take a moment and try to remember what the different characteristics of life are. So if you need a cheat sheet, we recorded these on your 1A page, but see if you can think back to what some of those major categories were. Here's a couple. So for one thing, organisms are made of cells. They reproduce, have homeostasis, grow and respond, and so on and so forth. But the one that we're really going to focus in on today is obtaining and using energy. So we have learned how plants do photosynthesis, and they essentially make their own food. They make glucose, which is a form of stored energy, along with starch. All of the biomolecules are really some kind of stored energy. Proteins, lipids, carbohydrates, those are stored energy. So today we're going to really focus in on how we take that stored energy and use it. So this is where we're going to do our 7A page. So at the top of your 7A page, go ahead and take a moment and pause and write out our essential question for today. How do organisms obtain and use energy from the food that they eat? I should also put in here, or make, for plants. And as we move through these lessons, I want you to kind of think about a couple of thought questions. How do we get our energy? Whether it's a plant or us as humans, how do we get our energy? Do all organisms get that energy in the same way, or are there differences? And then finally, I'm bringing in kind of an exercise analogy, but it applies here too. What does it mean to burn calories? Because oftentimes burning calories means that you are, expending energy, burning off fat or whatever it might be. So what does that actually mean in a biology sense? Okay, so the first point I think that's important to make, and as I move through these, I think it would be best if you just kind of listened as I talk through the slides, and then that'll give you an opportunity to then kind of look at all the information and then go back and make a notes page that goes along with it, similar to what we did in the last journal entry. And I can share a picture of what mine looks like at the end, but we're kind of getting to the point now where you should be kind of taking the information and figuring out how you want to best put it into your notebooks. So starting off with the main point that glucose has the power. If we remember, plants have the ability to do photosynthesis. So they really took energy from the sun and used that radiant or sun energy to create glucose. And that energy is kind of stored in what we call chemical bonds. So in between the different bonds of the glucose molecule, there is chemical energy, and that's potential energy, meaning that it has the potential to do something later. You can use it later. So plants are awesome because they were able to really, again, use the sun's energy, create glucose, and store it as starch. And that's really where the energy is sitting. And so then when the organism needs that energy, then it can actually utilize it. And that's the trick, right? How do we actually access that energy that's stored in glucose? Because even plants, if they make it, they still have to utilize it. And us as people, we can't make it. We have to eat it. So how does, the energy from glucose magically make its way from the food that we eat to the energy that we need? So for us, we eat it, but then we have to burn it. And that's where the analogy to burning calories comes in. Plants make it, but then they also need to burn it. So them just going and doing photosynthesis and making glucose is not enough. They actually do respiration also. So the idea here is that glucose is burned, and when we burn it, so to speak, it's able to provide energy to make us go. And you can kind of think about this in the sense of, in a car, you add gasoline as the fuel, and that's what makes the car go. That fuel is burned, and then that makes the car move. For our bodies, glucose is like our fuel, and then we burn it, and we are able to kind of carry out all of our daily functions. And that process really of burning glucose and getting it to the point of a usable energy source is called cellular respiration. And so again, the definition I would say of cellular respiration, glucose is broken down and the energy is transferred into a form that cells can use. And I say that because glucose has energy stored inside of it, but at that point in time, it's not really something that the cell can use. It has to be processed and broken down into something called ATP. And I'll explain a little bit more about that in a minute. But ATP is like the usable energy source for our cells. So I want you to think about this as a currency exchange. It would be like if you went to the grocery store here and tried to buy something, you would need dollars. But if you only had, euros or pesos, that's not going to get you what you need. It is a source of money, but it's not going to be able to buy you the things that you need here. And so that would be kind of representing glucose. And then when you turn it into the currency that the cell can use, or American dollars and coins, then that's the usable energy source. I also want you to look at the overall equation. In terms of respiration, you're going to need a couple of things. And I'll talk about the equation again on the next slide. It requires some oxygen. Carbon dioxide is given off as well as water. So it's not just only glucose to energy. There are a couple other things as well. And in the bottom photo, you can kind of see the inside of a cell. This is a part of a cell that we will learn about when we learn all about cells. It's called a mitochondria, and it's the powerhouse of the cell. It is where all of this respiration magic happens. But for right now, just kind of know that this is something that all of our cells do, which is why it's called cellular respiration. Okay, so let's look at this equation in a little bit more detail. Please make sure you definitely do write this into your notes. But we start with glucose, and then we combine it with some oxygen that we breathe in. So 6 oxygens are breathed in by us. And then respiration happens, and we are able to create the energy that we need. And it is important to know that some of that energy is given off as heat. It's what keeps us warm, but most of it is in the form of ATP that the cell can then use to, cash in our energy and use it to keep us alive and doing all the things we need to do. We also, in the process, make carbon dioxide, which we breathe out. So in that regard, the respiration part, the respiratory system and breathing does come into play. But don't confuse breathing with cellular respiration alone. There's a lot more going on there. And then it also makes water. I want you to also think about this equation and the key players: glucose, oxygen, energy, carbon dioxide, and water. Where have we seen these before? If I just flipped the arrow on this equation, it would look a whole lot like photosynthesis. If we remember, plants take in CO2 and they need water, and they use energy from the sun. They give off oxygen and they produce glucose. So it's heavily related. It's kind of the opposite of photosynthesis, because instead of making glucose, we're breaking it down. And it's important to realize that almost all organisms do this, and almost all cells, even plants. As I mentioned, this happens in a special part in the cell called the mitochondria. But plant cells do it, animal cells do it, almost all organisms and all cells, because this is our main source of, getting the energy that we need. And if we can't get the energy that we need, then we can't keep ourselves alive. Okay. So let's talk a little bit more about ATP. ATP is the energy the cell can use. Think of it like the cell's battery. It holds the energy to be released. And it does this because it holds the energy in some of the bonds. Just like we had talked about energy being stored in glucose, energy is stored in the ATP molecule. And then it can be released in your body at the right place at the right time. But I'm going to kind of continue the battery analogy. So just kind of think of ATP as the rechargeable battery of the cell. So the ATP is kind of the charged version. When you start to break those bonds, then that's you kind of using up that molecule. And every time you break some of those bonds, you release energy. And that released energy goes off and does some work. It fuels all of the reactions that our body needs to stay alive and to keep us alive. And I want you to also think of ATP as really a rechargeable battery, because it can be recharged. If you reform those bonds by breaking down other glucose molecules, you can recharge that battery to use again and again and again. So it's kind of like a recyclable process. The more glucose you have and the more breaking down of it you do, the more ATP you can make. And then you can go and use that ATP. And just as batteries, can power multiple devices oftentimes, ATP powers nearly all of the processes in living things. It's in movement, it's in growth, it's in homeostasis, everything. So it fuels all of the things your body needs. So just kind of putting it all together here, I want you to think about, where does the energy that we need come from and how do we get to it? Well, our main source of energy always, always, always is going to come back to the sun. And then photosynthesis, as we've learned, builds glucose molecules that then can be broken down using respiration. And as we break that down, then we get our ATP, which is our usable form of energy. And when the bonds get broken, that energy is released to do work. And here I just kind of show that in graphical form as a cycle. And it is really a cycle. If you think about, the products of photosynthesis, it makes glucose and gives off oxygen that we then, as animals, and even plants do this too, they take that glucose and oxygen and they do respiration to make energy. In the process, giving off some CO2 and water, which go right back to plants to do more photosynthesis. So it really is like a cycle of energy that goes all the way through. Okay, so that's really all of the key info for the A page. So I want you to pause and I want you to kind of go back through the previous slides and I want you to create an A page of notes for yourself that goes through the key pieces of cellular respiration. And if you want to kind of deep dive a little bit more, at the end of this PowerPoint, I do have more detailed slides that tell you a little bit more about cellular respiration in terms of what it is and the controlled reactions. It's actually a series of 3 steps, and I kind of show you what goes in and what comes out in each one of those steps. So if you want the detailed explanation, it's in here just to kind of show you that that's a 3-step process. And we had learned that photosynthesis is a 2-step process before. It's just something to kind of look through. And if maybe IB is in your future biology, then it might be worth just kind of looking through those slides. All right. So if we make it to the B page, what I'm going to have everybody do is we are going to compare and contrast photosynthesis and respiration. So I've created a couple of group slides, and on these group slides, I'm going to break everyone into a breakout room group of 4, and there's a short video that talks a little bit about the 2 processes and how they are alike and different. And so you're going to watch it all the way up until that 3-minute mark. And then each group will kind of have a slide where they can compare and contrast the 2 processes. So the group will type in here so that I can kind of see everybody's response. But then also on your B page, I'm going to want you to recreate that same table so that you have the notes for yourself. And so at the top of your B page, we will have notes with the group of where you've gone through and compared and contrasted photosynthesis and respiration. When we get to the bottom page, we are going to create kind of a comic strip of respiration and what's going on and where the energy is going. You're going to kind of track the energy from, let's say, the sun to some vegetables that you eat to an activity that you're going to do. And so that's going to be on the bottom of your 7B page. All right. So just kind of wrapping it up, additional resources. I think this explanation here in the bottom video, Cellular Respiration Simplified, is really helpful to kind of give you a basic understanding of what's going on without getting too detailed. The Amoeba Sisters video is also good, but it goes into a little bit more detail than the top part of the presentation is. If you want those detailed 3 steps of the process, that's an excellent video. Then if you want to go to the textbook to read a little bit more about it, see some more videos, do some practice questions, you can go to cellular respiration or ATP specifically. All right. So the goal here of today's class is to talk a little bit about how energy gets from the food that we eat or make and then can be used to keep us alive. And then talking a little bit more about respiration and the importance of ATP. Your job is to finish out that A page and make sure that your notes are detailed and complete, as well as adding in review questions, and a summary so that is done and complete. All right, thanks for listening.